Good evening. Thanks for coming. My name is Rich Sapanik. I've been with the organization for, I lost track, at least 10 years. Currently, I am the a director and the treasurer. So, and also I seem to put together most of the programs. And tonight's program, our speaker, she has worked in higher education. She earned a BA from Buffalo Broadcasting from Buff State. And how many of you have done forest lawn tours? Okay, I'm a docent there. Laura was responsible for the last couple of years of organizing and putting those together. So that's where I know her from. But anyway, so tonight's program is going to be famous women from Western New York. Now, what you may, most people know, we have a president buried at Forest Lawn, but do you know we have a female presidential candidate buried in Forest Lawn? So you're going to find out about a lot of women here that you probably didn't know about. So anyway, just to plug a few other things, next month we're having bands and bandsmen of the Civil War. This guy has played with the Philharmonic. He will have instruments and he'll play music that they would have played, the brigades would have played in the Civil War. In May, ice bridges of Niagara Falls. Believe it or not, people used to walk on them until the early 1900s. And there's a great story about a president who might not have been a president. So next month, that's in May, and Carol used to work for the state park, so she knows all about it. And then in June, immigrants, the story of the immigrants, German immigrants in Western New York, which is appropriate because this is was founded as a German church. So unless anybody else has any further questions, I present to you Laura Fitzgerald, and take it away.
Okay, I'm usually pretty good at projecting my voice, but this is really nice to have a microphone. So like Rich said, I'm Laura Fitzgerald. I used to be at Forest Lawn Cemetery. So a lot of these people that I'm going to talk about today, of course, are also happen to be buried there. I was trying to think of a good image to put in the beginning of the slideshow, and I'm like, what can I put there? Because I don't have a logo for myself. And I thought, what better person to put there than Shark Girl? Because everyone knows her, and she certainly is a famous female from Western New York. Okay, so I thought I'd start out first by talking about women that reflected a particular time in history. So the first person I want to talk about is America Pickney Peters Williams, and she was actually Martha Washington's great-granddaughter. Martha Washington was married before she was married to George Washington, so America was, so that was from her first marriage. She was actually married to General Charles Colesworth Pickney, who ran against Thomas Jefferson for president. And she had two sisters named Britannia and Columbia. So I thought that was kind of fun too. She was one of a lot of relocation burials that were from the old North Street Cemetery. And she came to Buffalo with her husband, who was a land surveyor, and was sent to survey the land of the Buffalo Harbor. And she came from a lot of very privileged background, very wealthy. In fact, if you're ever in the DC area and you have the opportunity to visit Tudor Place, that was her family estate. And it's quite substantial. So she was very nervous about coming to this backwaters town. She thought it was going to be an Indian outpost, but she actually came here and she really grew to love it here. And then we have probably one of the more tragic figures in Buffalo history, Margaret St. John. I mean, this woman had quite a life. She moved here in 1810 from Connecticut with her husband and 10 children. And then when they arrived in Buffalo, they had an 11th child. Her son, Cyrus, went on a camping trip and actually came down with distemper and died a few days later. During the War of 1812, she sent most of her younger children to live with their oldest sister, Maria, and her husband to keep them safe from the British while they were in town. And in in 1813, she lost her son and her husband Elijah as they were running supplies across the border to the American troops during the War of 1812. And their boat was sunk and they drowned in the river. So after the burning of Buffalo, there were only 3 properties that remained standing. The jail, a local blacksmith shop, and Margaret St. John's house. And if you're ever downtown and you see where the Road Less Traveled Theater Company is, you'll see that there's a plaque right around there on the buildings there, and that's where her house once stood when it was the village of Buffalo. And it's said that the reason that her house survived was that she used to give the British troops brandy to keep them warm. She died in 1847, and her body also was relocated from the Buffalo City Cemetery to Forest Lawn. This is Charlotte Mulligan. She's also sort of tragic, but actually she's more of a hopeful character because she took a tragedy and she turned it into something good. Charlotte grew up in a very prominent family in Buffalo. She used to teach voice lessons and violin, and she had 2 older brothers, and both of them enlisted in the Union Army, and they both died during the war. So from that point forward, she made a vow, and she said that from this point forward, she's never going to get married, and she's going to devote her life to helping soldiers who are dislocated or who are impoverished by the war. So she established what's called the Honor Guard, and it was a privilege system. So she had a building where she could house some veterans who had nowhere to live, and you earned a certain amount of points. So if you went to church every Sunday, you would earn some points. If you hadn't, before the war broke out and you hadn't finished your education, if you went back to school and you got your degree, you earned points. And that would kind of determine where you lived in the household that she gave these veterans. And basically everybody wanted to live, in the more social areas of the building, like near the library, which was on the 2nd or 3rd floor. So, the more points you had, you could move up. She also bought a lot of land in Forest Lawn. So if you ever see her gravesite, all of the land surrounding it are members of the Honor Guard. And the Honor Guard also served a really good function when Lincoln's funeral train came through Buffalo. They actually stood guard over Lincoln's body where it was laying in rest when people were coming to visit it in St. James Hall. And you'll notice too, she has a white carnation on. And that white carnation represents pure eternal love or heartache. And she's said to have worn it all the time in honor of her brothers. And a lot of other people would probably be more familiar with Charlotte because she also founded the 20th Century Club on Buffalo, which was a women's club. And she had hoped to have it open in time for the Pan American Exposition, but unfortunately she died right before the building was complete, so she never got to fully see it in its glory. And then we have some women of the stage and screen. So we have Katherine Cornell here, who's known as the First Lady of Theater. She was born in Berlin, but she grew up in Buffalo. And if you look to this house right here, this is the Peter Cornell Mansion, and Peter Cornell was Katherine's grandfather. And if you were ever to go inside, let me see if I can use this pointer that Rich gave me. Right up here, if you're ever to go inside there, there's actually a theater up there. And she used to watch her grandfather, who was part of the Buffalo Amateurs, which was a theater group, and they put on annual performances. And it's said that that's where she got her love of the theater, was by attending these performances. But it's really interesting inside there because you can go inside and they actually have a press box. So they would stick the press away from the crowds because they didn't want the crowds to be gossiping, and they didn't want the press to overhear their conversations. So anyway, she went on to pursue, she actually inherited money when her grandfather died in 1915, so she went to pursue her theater dream in New York City. Marion DeForest, who's another woman I'll be talking about shortly, helped to launch her career when she performed as Josephine March in Marion DeForest's version of Little Women, which was in both London and New York. And her most notable performance was as Elizabeth Barrett Browning in 1921's Broadway production of The Barretts of Wimpole Street. Okay, so if you were driving up from Niagara Square, and you know those where the old Lord Cholmondeley's is and where all those brownstones are, it's directly across the street. And that was actually designed by Buffalo architect Edward Austin Kent, who died on the Titanic, designed that house as well. Another woman who's kind of interesting is Kathleen Howard, and she had quite a diverse career. She actually went to New York, and she was, I believe, the first woman from Buffalo to be in the Metropolitan Opera Company as a singer. So she started there. She started her career singing opera, and if you actually go on YouTube, you can actually find clips where you can actually hear her singing, which is kind of neat. After that, she went on to be a fashion editor for Harper's Bazaar magazine, and she actually wrote a book, Confessions of an Opera Singer, that was also that she authored. And then from there, she went on to become a movie actress, and she starred in over 40 films in Hollywood. She was known as one of W.C. Field's work wives. She appeared in 2 of his films, It's a Gift and Man on the Flying Trapeze. No, they were not. No, yeah. No, no, they weren't. They were when he started talking, yeah. Okay, then this lady is the one I mentioned before, Marion DeForest. She was one of the first female reporters in Buffalo or Western New York. She was the editor of the women's department of the Buffalo Express, the city editor of the Buffalo Commercial, and she also helped to organize the Buffalo Philharmonic Orchestra. And if you're ever driving by Delaware Park on the S-curves, and you see that statue, that metal statue of that human person holding that circle, that's in honor of Marion DeForest, and it's called Spirit of Womanhood. She wrote the stage adaptation of Louise May Alcott's Little Women for Broadway in London, like I said, and Catherine Cornell starred in that as Josephine March. She also founded, with a group of friends, Zonta International, which is an organization that helps improve the status of women worldwide, and that was established at the Statler Hotel. And then in 2001, she was inducted into the Buffalo Women's Hall of Fame. And then here are some women that made a difference. So we have Anna Reinstein, and she has an incredibly interesting life. In fact, I can't stop reading about her because she came here from Poland. She was born in Poland in 1866, I think 1866, yep. And she graduated in Switzerland after studying medicine and pharmacy for 5 years. And then through involvement with a leftist group, she met her future husband, Boris. And Boris was from Russia, and he also studied pharmacy. He was kind of a character, and there's a lot of interesting stories about when they ended up separating when they were married. He basically left her here in the US with the kids, and then he went back to Russia. But when they were in Paris after getting married, he was arrested because they were suspicious that he was involved in a plot to assassinate Tsar Nicholas III. So Anna and her daughter came here to the U.S., where she began to practice as a midwife until she could pass her medical exams to become a full-fledged doctor. Once she did, she specialized in obstetrics and also was an internist. And she was one of the very first female doctors to practice in the city of Buffalo. And it's said that she, when she would come to a person's house, because she was fluent in Polish and English, she would often help the immigrants on the east side. And she would not only deliver the child, but she would make sure that the kids got breakfast and that they got off to school okay at the same time. So she was quite the trailblazer in her time. And then she had a son in 1904, and then Boris ran a pharmacy until he eventually returned to Russia in 1917, where he participated in the revolution over there. And he actually worked in the propaganda department for the Bolshevik government, for Lenin, and he did remarry, even though he was already married. But there's a story I read once where they met in international waters in New York City outside a barge just to see each other and catch up, which is, and this was after he got remarried, so kind of interesting. But Anna really established herself on the east side of Buffalo, and you'll notice that there's a library named after her and another library named after her daughter-in-law. Okay, she died at the age of 83 in 1948 from an infection after having a hip surgery from an injury that she sustained while still practicing medicine. Then we have Elizabeth Coe Marshall. She was a Sunday school teacher at the First Presbyterian Church. And she came from, again, a very affluent family. And she really had an interest in helping the needy and those less fortunate. So she was always taking up collections from her students for this cause or that. And she ended up becoming very ill, and she was bedridden for a number of months. And she couldn't really do much for herself. So while she was at home, she was recovering, and she had a 24-hour nurse help that would help her in any way she needed. And she thought, well, geez, I'm really fortunate to be able to afford this. There are a lot of people out there who can't. So she went back to her Sunday school class, and she took up a collection, and she was the one who founded the Visiting Nurses Association. And it began in 1885, where they began sending nurses to the homes of the sick, recuperating, and disabled. And then it officially became the Visiting Nurses Association in 1928. And it was recognized by the Smithsonian Institution, which actually put together an exhibit all about the Visiting Nurses Association and Elizabeth Coe Marshall. And this lady is Annie Singleton, and a lot of people don't know about her. She grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, and she and her husband, Archie, met down south, but they decided, like a lot of African Americans at the time, to move up into the northern states where there was greater opportunity for them. So they moved up to Ithaca, and they purchased a home right at the bottom of the hill from Cornell University. And at that time, African American students were allowed to attend classes at the university, but they were not allowed to live on campus. There was no housing for them. So she and her husband rented out a room to a gentleman by the name of Robert Harold Ogle. And he and his friends formed a literary group called Alpha Phi Alpha. And they were called the Seven Jewels by most people, but she just referred to them as her boys. And Alpha Phi Alpha became the first African-American intercollegiate fraternity in the United States. And it's now it's like the number one of the Divine Nine. In 1939, Alpha Phi Alpha held an annual conference in New York City and granted her the title Mother of the Fraternity. And then in 2011, the Alpha Phi Alpha purchased a new stone and a plaque and had a dedication ceremony, which was attended by Alpha's national president and fraternity members from all across the United States to honor her. And this is Sarah Hinson. Sarah was a teacher and a principal in the Buffalo Public School System. She was the first woman to serve on the Buffalo School Board. And she is known for having her students recite the Pledge of Allegiance in the classroom. And she's one of the founders of Flag Day, which is June 14th, 1891. Does anybody know why June 14th was picked as Flag Day? No. Oh, you're thinking of Bastille Day, which is in July, but no. Yeah, Rich, go ahead.
Isn't that the day that we adopted the flag?
Yeah, that's when the Continental Congress accepted Betsy Ross's design as the flag for the United States. Good job, Rich. And in 1916, President Woodrow Wilson made it an official holiday, national holiday. She is, and every year on Flag Day, they have 700 students who do a parade down Main Street and come in to have a little ceremony there where they burn retired flags as well. Yep. And this is one that a lot of people don't know about, but she's one of my very favorite stories. I was doing research for a tour about Black history makers, and I came across her story and was really impressed by it. Laura Davis Jackson, these are just basic facts on her, but she had a couple of sons, and they got into some trouble on the east side of Buffalo, and they were involved in a shooting on the east side of Buffalo. One of them was injured and survived, and the other one died. And she said that from that day forward, she said that she never would have made it through that tragedy had she not had such a supportive family and friends to lean on. So she made it a point to always be there when instances in the future happen. So she founded an organization called DEATH, which stands for Dealing Effectively After the Homicide. And she would actually have a police scanner on, and she always listened, and whenever there was a shooting or anything, she would know ahead of time, or the cops would know to call her, and she would always reach out to family members, and she would help them in any way she could. She would help them by going to the police station and talking to the detectives. She would help them make funeral arrangements. If they needed somebody to watch the kids for a little while because they had to take care of something, she was always there. Because she said she never wanted to go through that by herself. From then, she also approached the United Way and the History Museum, and they put together an exhibit where they showed like a chalk outline of a person who had passed, and then they had all these red threads that showed how that one death was connected in so many different ways, so that people could see a visual representation of how death from a homicide affects people. She spoke to the youths in the detention center downtown that were involved in gang activity to show them, to try and implore them to change their ways so that it wouldn't happen again in the future to other families. Let's see. And then in the Buffalo chapter, the NAACP honored her in 2000 with their Daniel Ackerman Community Service Award for all of her efforts.
She also did the Common Ground exhibit in Washington with the empty shoes of those who've been shot by guns.
Oh, she did. Oh, thank you. Did you really? Oh, wow, that's amazing.
I know her.
That's great. I didn't know about that. So, okay.
I don't know if it's on YouTube or anything like that.
Yeah, I tried to.
Pretty profound to
For sure. Yeah. It was called Common Grounds, you said? Okay. Oh, okay, okay. Oh, okay, so that must have been part of it as well, maybe. And then it went to Washington, okay. Oh, okay.
So has she passed?
She has, yeah.
Is she at Forest?
She is, yeah, she is.
I think your son was killed outside the Burger King on Bailey Avenue.
Yeah. And then this is another woman, Patricia Capstraw Wilkins. And she was the one who came up with the idea of Heard About Buffalo, which raised $1.5 million for Roswell Park Cancer Institute. Unfortunately, her, and if you read the inscription on it, it says the last and best of the herd, which is really sweet.
Where is that located?
That's over by the S curves on Delaware Avenue, yeah. By Rick James, exactly. By Rick James and Barbara Franklin, Aretha Franklin's mother, yep. And then this one, Mariah Love. I'm sure you've all heard this name. So how many of you heard of the Charity Ball? Okay. Well, so Mariah Love she was also a very interesting woman. She grew up, I think, in Clarence, I believe. And her parents were staunch abolitionists. And her father was actually a judge for Erie County, and he would often take her or her siblings to tour his jurisdiction and to see how the true poor people actually lived, because being in an affluent family like hers, she wasn't often exposed to that. But her parents were very, very involved in social causes. She was forbidden to go into a barn on their property because she later found by accident, she claims, when the barn door was closing, she saw all these baskets in there, and she realized that what was happening was her parents were running slaves across the border into Canada for freedom. So her father would run them in the cart at night, at dusk, and her mother would pack up little lunches for them in baskets. So he basically they really instilled in her to really help people that were less fortunate than she was. And she made numerous trips to Europe. I believe it was 19 trips in her lifetime to Europe. And one of her very favorite places to go was France. So she came home from a trip to France, and when she was 11 years old, her father actually showed her an article in the newspaper that really affected her. Back at that time, it was the turn of the century, and all these people were working in the industry and in factories and things like that. And the death rate was really high for men who worked in these factories. They would or they could just get maimed, and then they couldn't work anymore. So then these women would have these children, and what are we going to do with our kids when we go to work? We have to work to put food on the table, but what are we going to do with the kids while we're gone? So she had read an article about this woman who had actually nailed her 3-year-old child's dress to the floor to prevent her from wandering into the fireplace when she went to work during the day. But unfortunately, she came home that night to discover that her child had actually pulled so hard on the dress had torn, and she fell into the fireplace and died anyway. And this just broke Mariah's heart, and she couldn't stand it. So she then decided to form something called a crèche, which is something that she had learned about in France, where it was a place where a safe place where mothers could drop off their children during the day when they had to go to work, and they would be fed meals, and they'd be educated and well cared for. So she brought the idea back here to Buffalo, and she founded the first daycare center in the United States called the Fitch Crèche, which was over on Swan Street. And the charity ball was what funded the Fitch Crèche. That was the original purpose. I have a picture of here. She was also in that group, the Buffalo Amateurs, the theater group that was in the Cornell Mansion. And there she is dressed up as Queen Victoria. So that was one of her hobbies. But even now, her legacy continues. Even though the Fitch Creche is no longer around, they have a convalescence fund. So if you're a person who has to have a lot of medical treatments and you spend more than you have and you need to recoup some of that money, you can approach that organization and they will. They try to help as many people as they can. And then we have some women in the arts. So this is Katherine Green, and she is known as the mother of the detective novel. She wrote 35 detective novels in her lifetime. The first and the most successful was called The Leavenworth Case, and it actually had a reprinting a couple of years ago. But she was really interesting because at that time, they always wanted to keep women away from, the horrors of crime and death. So she would actually dress up in costumes to go to court hearings to hear details on court cases so that she could use this material in her novels. And she actually married a Roycroft furniture designer by the name of Charles Rohlfs. And if you ever go to Roycroft, they do have a few of his pieces. There's some pieces, I think, in Buckingham Palace. And he was actually an unsuccessful actor who turned into a very successful furniture designer. But fans of her work included Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, and both Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were fans of her work. And this is my all-time favorite Western New York person. I don't know if any of you saw it last night. Apparently it was on WNED. I've seen it before, so I didn't stay up for it. But Mabel Ganson grew up on Delaware Avenue, and if you ever really want a good read, a very good read on Buffalo history, and you want to know about people who lived here at the turn of the century, I highly recommend her biography. Her first biography was called Intimate Memories, Volume 1. And she was quite the spitfire. She grew up on Delaware Avenue in one of the most prominent families. Her father was a lawyer, and her grandfather and her mother were very big in the banking industry. She tells some incredibly funny stories about Nina Wilcox in the Wilcox Mansion and some other very prominent families on Delaware Avenue. And the place where her house used to stand is where the Westbrook Apartments now stand. So she lived many, many lifetimes, this woman. So she originated as Mabel Ganson, but she was not a socialite. I mean, she was a socialite, but she was very much a tomboy, and she hated all that nonsense. So she actually did do a coming out party in the 20th Century Club against her will, and she made it a point to not smile in any of the pictures. And she fell in love with Charles, I think it was Charles Evans, and his family, I think, built ships in the Canal District, and they had this torrid love affair, and they ran off and actually eloped and got married. But then she got pregnant, and within a year, and her husband died in a hunting accident. So she almost had a nervous breakdown because then she realized she had to, take sole responsibility for bringing this child into the world, and she wasn't really that kind of person. So her parents are like, okay, well, we're going to send you on a cruise, complete with nannies. And while she was there, she met Edwin Dodge, who was a prominent architect from Boston, who became very smitten with her. And by the end of the cruise, actually proposed marriage, and they got married. And they went to Italy, and they bought one of the Medici's villas in Tuscany in Arcetri, Italy, and they named it Villa Corona. And they just really designed the heck out of it. She kind of went through, she was quite an art collector, and she went through Europe and she just collected all kinds of art. And while doing so, she befriended Leo and Gertrude Stein in Paris. And she really loved visiting with them and seeing all the kinds of people that they befriended, like Pablo Picasso, Ernest Hemingway. So she went through and she brought what was called the salon movement, which is what they did, where they would hold these salons with all these intellectual peoples in their household and have these great conversations and learn about art and music and all kinds of things. So she eventually got bored with her second husband, Edwin, and she divorced him. And she moved to Greenwich Village in New York City, where she started having these salons. And she became friends with Edward Steichen and Alfred Stieglitz and like proteges of Freud and all these incredible people. And she has a book called Movers and Shakers, all about her experience living in New York. And she got very involved with the suffragette movement. But again, then she got bored there. So then she did help mount the 1913 Armory Show of new European art in New York, and she's known as one of the people that brought post-impressionistic modern art to the United States. She's one of 3 people. After that, she ended up marrying another painter. I can't even remember which name it was at this point. Right, Maurice Stern, right. And then they were going to go on their honeymoon to New Mexico. But for some reason, they couldn't go at the same time, so he sent her ahead of time. And she got to Taos, New Mexico, and she fell in love with it. And by the time he arrived there, she had already rented a villa for 6 months and had decided she was going to stay there whether he wanted to or not. And she actually helped to establish a artist colony out there, and as well as helped to launch the careers of people like Ansel Adams and D.H. Lawrence. So she really knew everybody. And she was also very good friends with Georgia O'Keeffe. And when Georgia O'Keeffe found out that her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, was having an affair with one of his models, she was so devastated that Mabel sent her a ticket to come see her in New Mexico. And she stayed with Mabel in New Mexico. And so then you see all of that new art that came out from Georgia O'Keeffe from New Mexico, and that was partially because of Mabel. But she actually married her final husband, who was actually, I think she married 5 times. And Tony was actually married when she met him. He was a Native American that lived in the area in Taos, and he actually left his wife to marry Mabel. But they lived the rest of their lives together.
Whatever happened to her child?
He continued to live with her. I think he ended up, he didn't live very long. I mean, he lived, but I think he died shortly after she did, so he didn't live a very long life. But they definitely had a messed up relationship because she wasn't very attentive, as you can imagine.
Did you ever hear how Gertrude Stein's brother Leo referred to what Gertrude wrote about Mabel, about her?
No.
He called it Mabel Dodge Hodgepodge.
That sums it up pretty good, yeah.
So Mabel did not really hang around Buffalo all that.
No, but she was from here. She grew up here. Yeah.
You mentioned separate honeymoons. How does that work?
It wasn't, yeah, I don't think it was separate. I think they were going to go on their honeymoon, but he was in the middle of some project or something, and he had to finish it before he could go, so he sent her ahead of time. Yeah.
I'm sure she had fun.
Oh, she had them all, yeah.
With or without him.
Yes. And this is Annie Crawford. Annie Crawford was a artist, and her father actually owned Crawford and Sons Monument Company, which was located where the Rite Aid is on West Delavan Avenue in Delaware. That was where their property was. And she studied art, but she actually was unique because she formed a partnership with another female artist called named Emma Kahn, and they would often sign their works together. But she did all kinds of things like innovations in printmaking, so that if visitors came to an art gallery and they saw a piece of her work and they liked it, and they necessarily couldn't afford to take the actual original home or pay for the original, she came up with printmaking ways to make these prints of her works more affordable to the general public. So every time I'm in an art gallery gift shop, I always think of Annie Crawford and think how she made innovations so that I can take home copies of some of these famous works that I'm fond of. And she was really good friends with Katherine Green's husband, Charles Rohlfs, the furniture maker. So they would often make deals where she would paint family portraits of their family in exchange for him providing handcrafted frames to accompany some of her works. And then this is Evelyn Rumsey Cary. And she's one of the Rumsey, Cary Rumseys. I can never keep them all straight. I actually initially had the name wrong when I had the thing, and I was like, wait, she was married to Dr. Cary, so her last name must be Cary, not Rumsey. So she was Bronson Rumsey's daughter, and she studied art. And she's most popularly known for Spirit of the Niagara, which is a kind of a version of the Pan American Exposition pose here of the woman in Niagara Falls. So she designed the Pan American Exposition poster that was sold to promote the upcoming exposition. Then here is a self-portrait in the middle. Not a very happy person, I can tell. Very stern. And then to the right is a poster that she designed for the suffrage movement. She was very big in the suffrage movement. And that poster circulated nationally and was very, very popular.
What's the text on that? Do you have one?
Let's see. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. And then this is a woman who grew up here in Tonawanda that I found. And she was actually born today, only in 1908 in Tonawanda. She learned to draw while she was recovering from a leg injury, and she actually ran a dressmaking shop from her home while she was in high school. She actually went on to New York City to study design, and she got her degree in illustration. And later in the 1930s and 40s, she ran a design studio on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. And many of her designs sold in stores nationally, beginning in 1934. She also went on to design and create comic strips. A friend of hers remarked that her hair looked like a mop on the top of her head. So then she developed a character based on herself called Mopsy, and that was the comic strip that she was most well known for. And that ran in syndication from 1937 to 1966 in over 300 newspapers in over 11 countries. During World War II, she also worked in a musician's factory and also helped with nursing efforts during the war. And she also wrote a couple of comic strips for the war effort, Betty G.I. and Flyin' Jenny for the Women's Army Corps And then in the 60s, she wrote a daily column called Dear Guys and Gals, and she died in Glendale, California from lung cancer in 1966. And the woman over here on the far right, this is a dress she designed for a movie. She designed a lot of costumes for movies, and this is one of the ones that she designed. Yeah, probably that Parker family, I'm wondering. I don't know. We'll have to ask Angela Keppel that one, right? Okay, trailblazing women. Okay, so Mary Talbert. She was a lifetime civil rights activist. She was the first female principal in the state of Arkansas, where she graduated college. She married a local businessman by the name of William Talbert, who is said to have gotten his money from the gold rush, believe it or not, in California. And she moved to Buffalo. And it's said that they hosted the first unofficial meeting of the NAACP, or the Niagara Movement, in her living room. And she was very prominent in the community, and she was very close friends with Reverend Nash as well. They lived right next door to each other, and if you're ever down on Michigan Street and you see the Baptist church there, there's a plaque showing where her house once stood. But she and Reverend Nash came together and they created the Negro exhibit at the Pan American Exposition because they thought it was really important to portray African Americans in a good light, because at the as you probably all know, at the Pan Am, darkest Africa and the old plantation were the common way that people thought of the African American population, and they wanted to show and highlight the successes and the academic pursuits of African Americans at the fair. She also served as a nurse in the Red Cross during World War I. She was the president of the National Association of Colored Women. And she launched an anti-lynching campaign. That was something that she was very passionate about also. And she spoke all over the world about that. There's a lot more about this woman, and I could go on for days about it, but she was a really big deal, and we're very proud that she's here from Buffalo. She was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 2005 in Seneca Falls. And then this is Elizabeth Lewis Cale, and if any of you have been, fortunate or unfortunate to come on my tours of Forest Lawn, you always know that somehow or another, my best friend's family always comes into my path in some way. So this is Elizabeth Lewis Cale, or otherwise known as Libby Cale. And she came from a very prominent Buffalo family, like I said. And when she got out of school, she worked for the Buffalo Courier Express as writing a society column, because of all of her connections in that era, in that world. But then she decided that she was going to take a photography class at the Seneca Vocation Center. And she became so enamored with photography that she actually went to her editor and she convinced him to allow her to switch from writing the society column to becoming one of the photojournalists for the paper. And to try and dissuade her passion, he basically had her do nothing but really atrocious accidents and autopsies and medical examinations when she first took the role, hoping that she would give up her passion and decide to just go back and write the society column like a good little girl. But no. She stuck with it, and she won the admiration of all of her male co-workers, and she actually went on to be the first female photojournalist in Buffalo. And some of the things, like she photographed a lot of famous people, like there's a picture here of her and Jack Dempsey. Another picture in the middle is of Judy Garland preparing for a performance in 1961. Sugar Ray Robinson. who was entertaining patients at a veterans hospital in 1953. She was there when one of the factories at the Larkin Company was burning. She photographed that. She also photographed the first automobile to roll off the stamping plant at the Ford stamping plant in Lackawanna. And she was also present for a surprise visit by Eleanor Roosevelt that a lot of people didn't know. They didn't know she was coming, and she got the scoop, and she actually was able to photograph her during that visit. And that was a pretty notorious visit too, because Eleanor Roosevelt came for a luncheon at the 20th Century Club, founded by Charlotte Mulligan. And in attendance was Harriet Mack, and Harriet Mack's husband was the editor of the Buffalo News, the opposing paper. And apparently at this luncheon, the women got together and they did a little skit, and they sort of poked a little bit of fun at Eleanor Roosevelt's female press conferences, and it offended Harriet Mack so much that she made a big stink about it, and she says, "I'm never coming back here again." She dissolved her membership. She says, "I can't believe that you would poke fun at, the First Lady of our nation." And Eleanor Roosevelt just let it roll off her back. She really didn't care that much. But that was the same visit that Libby Cale actually got a photograph of Eleanor Roosevelt. And then this is a special treat because I know her family. This was a photograph that my friend has in her house that Libby took. This is a photograph of one of the neighborhoods in Buffalo when we still had the trees. And it is unbelievably stunning. And it's what's known as photopictorialism. It's where they take a photograph and it's supposed to evoke an emotion from you like a painting would. And she was very much into this photopictorialism. Then this is another one of my favorites. This is Mary Cass. And Mary Cass actually, when she was in high school, she graduated high school and she went to work as just a general employee for the F.N. Burt Box Company at 500 Seneca Street. And she was a very, very hard worker. In fact, so hard of a worker that when Frederick Burt was retiring from the business and he sold it to a company in Toronto, the Moore Corporation, he said that he would only sell it to them if they agreed to let Mary be the executive and president of the company. So she was one of the first female executives in the country, and she saw them through their basically biggest expansion. They expanded up to 2,500 employees, and they used to design boxes for Avon, for cosmetics, for cigarette companies, for Seagram's. So that's her portrait in the middle there. There's a bulletin, one of the newsletters that the Burt's Box Company used to put out. They have that on the wall in 500 Seneca Street. And I actually took a tour of the building before it opened as a mixed-use space about, I don't know, probably 10, 15 years ago. And that's actually the view out of Mary Cass's office. That's the view that she looked out on. But she never married. She did adopt a son, one of the workers that was orphaned. She took a real shine to him, and she actually adopted him. And if you see her gravesite in Forest Lawn, he's buried right with her. And then, of course, we have Louise Bethune. And Louise Bethune wanted to study architecture, and she was actually supposed to go to Cornell to study architecture. But then she decided that instead of going to the university to study it, she would do it the old-fashioned way, and she would be an apprentice instead. So she became an apprentice for an architecture firm in Buffalo, where she met her husband, Robert Bethune. And then they had Bethune, and Bethune was their architectural firm that they formed together. But she was the first woman to ever be admitted into the American Institute of Architects. She was also the first woman to purchase a bicycle here in Buffalo, and she was known for riding her bicycle around. And she designed a lot of police precincts, Lockport High School, and then, of course, probably her most famous design is the Lafayette Hotel, which was supposed to open in time for the Pan American Exposition, but unfortunately didn't open until 3 years after the exposition was here. And then my last, but certainly not least, favorite person in Forest Lawn, Shirley Chisholm. Didn't even really know anything about Shirley Chisholm until a few years ago, because when she ran for presidency in 1972, I was only 3 years old, so I couldn't really make a connection to her. But the more I read about her, wow. So she grew up in Brooklyn. When she was 8 years old, her parents sent her and her two sisters to live with their grandmother in, oh no, I can't think of it. Anyway, sent her away to live with her grandmother where she was raised and she got a good education. Barbados, sorry, I knew I'd think of it. Meanwhile, they worked enough so that they could buy their first home, and they bought a brownstone in Brooklyn. So when Shirley and her sisters returned, they had a home in Brooklyn, which is where she grew up. She really excelled at school. She was very good at languages. She was very good at public speaking. She actually received scholarships to both Vassar and Columbia, but she couldn't afford to attend either one because she couldn't afford the room and board, and it would only cover tuition. So she lived at home, and she went to Brooklyn College, where she got her bachelor's in education. Then she went on to get her master's, I believe, at Columbia in early childhood education. She worked for the state as a consultant for early childhood education for a number of years. Was, I believe, like a principal at a school for a long time. And she's one of the founders of the WIC program. Then she decided to run for New York State Assembly, and she ran for New York State Assembly and won. Then she went to Congress, where she served 7 consecutive terms, and she helped establish the school lunch program, as well as the Black Caucus, as well as, oh boy, what's the other one? School lunch, WIC. Oh no. I didn't write it down because I always talk about her and I always remember, and I can't remember now. It's another big service. WIC. I don't know, maybe it'll come to me. But she was really something. She also was the first woman and the first African-American woman to run for the presidency under a major political party, the Democratic Party, in 1972. She wrote a couple of books. One was called The Good Fight. The other was the one that's pictured up here, Unbought and Unbossed, basically meaning that she would never compromise her principles for the almighty dollar. And what a lot of people don't know about Shirley is that even though she had campaign headquarters throughout the United States that were run entirely by volunteers, any money that they raised from campaigns doing that just kept the offices alive. Any other campaign expenses she charged personally on her American Express card. And once she was done, running for president, and she stepped down when she realized she wasn't going to win. She continued to serve in Congress. She helped political careers of so many people behind her, women, people of color. She had amazing quotes. One of her famous is, "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your own chair." And there's actually going to be a statue that's going in outside the Birchwood Mausoleum in Forest Lawn by a local artist, where she has Shirley standing at a podium showing the peace sign, And if you look next to the podium, there's a folding chair propped up against it, which I thought was really, really neat. She always tried to, especially she would go to schools and she would speak to black youth, and she would always tell them to always strive for excellence and never to just settle for mediocrity. She said there's too much mediocrity in this world, so she always encouraged them to do their very, very best, and she helped as many people as she could in that way. So, okay.
How did she come to be buried in Buffalo?
She married Arthur Hardwick, who was also a New York State Assemblyman, who actually owned a liquor store here in Buffalo. And his health was kind of failing, so once they got married, she retired from Congress. She moved to this area to help take care of him. But even when she was here, she was constantly going out of town to do speaking engagements all around the country. She was an incredible, incredible person. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.